Also that weird robotic voice to tell us the recording's in progress. And we're just gonna get started in about a minute. But hi, my name is Ryan. I'm with McNally Jackson Books. I'm one of the events hosts here. And I am very excited to be introducing one of for this event today, for Tracers in the Dark, the global hunt for the crime lords of cryptocurrency, which every time I mention that title to I was in school to, oh, there it is right there. Kashmir has it right in the front.
It's real.
It sounds like an amazing, like I was telling the pitch to some of my professors. I went to school today and they were like, this sounds like a badass event. And I was like, oh yeah, it gets, something's gonna go down. I cannot wait. So without further ado, I'm just gonna put some little groundskeeping rules before we start. We are gonna have a Q&A for the last part of this. It's gonna be, Kashmir's gonna sort of ask questions of Andy, and he's going to talk a little bit about the book, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions during the time, you can chat it, you can put it in the chat publicly, or you can message it privately to me, and we're going to go over them at the end. And also, I'm going to be putting the link for the book right now. You can buy it right now, and Andy has so graciously signed the book in the Brooklyn locations and is going to sign the book tomorrow in the Manhattan location. So you could actually order it online or pick it up in store and get it signed, or have it signed, have the signed copy. So without further ado, I'm just going to be introducing, oh, keep adding more people. Wonderful. We do events like this all the time, so you can check the events calendar for future events. And I just wanted to start by introducing our two lovely authors. So Andy Greenberg is a senior writer for Wired magazine, where he covers security, privacy, information, freedom, and hacker culture. His last book, Sandworm, and the excerpts from it were published in Wired, won awards including the General Loeb Award for International Reporting and the Cornelius Ryan Citation for Excellence from the Overseas Press Club. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife, documentary filmmaker Malika Sawali Warhol. So we just talked about Crown Heights and like all the amazing, I know you're Brooklyn based right now, but the amazing food that that we're talking about in Crown Heights. So it's good to feel someone that can also understand a good bagel and Crown Heights location stuff. So and our next guest is Kashmir Hill, who is a tech reporter at the New York Times. She writes about the unexpected and sometimes ominous ways technology is changing our lives, particularly when it comes to our privacy. She joined the Times in 2019 after having worked at Gizmodo Media Group, Fusion, Forbes Magazine, and Above the Law. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker and The Washington Post. She has degrees from Duke University, NYU, where she studied journalism. So thank you both so much for reading and talking about this. And I was gonna just bring it on to Kashmir.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and McNally Jackson for hosting this book event. I recently read the book. It is excellent. Very much a tech thriller, and I highly recommend it. And I'm not just saying that because Andy is someone I've known for a long time, but that's where I wanted to start, actually. Andy and I worked together at Forbes a decade ago. And Andy, you were the very first person, I think, who exposed me to Bitcoin. You were one of the very first journalists writing about it when it was worth pennies, fractions of a penny. And I just wonder if we can start with how Bitcoin first got on your radar.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's amazing to be doing this with you, Kashmir, because not only are you like, one of the top privacy and surveillance and, security reporters in the world, but we have this like shared history of being at Forbes during like the weird old days where you were like living on Bitcoin at one point, and I think for like weeks at a time living on Bitcoin alone. And I was like buying drugs with Bitcoin into the Forbes headquarters. So it's nice to like do this with like someone who remembers those strange times. But yeah, so I first came upon Bitcoin in 2011 when it was worth $1, actually. It had just gone up from 50 cents to $1, and everybody kind of couldn't believe that it had doubled in value. Like, wow, a whole dollar. And I came upon it because I had been writing a book about the cypherpunks. who were this like they began in the 1990s, this movement of sort of radical libertarians who believed that they could use encryption technologies to, the ability to like communicate secretly, and they hoped someday even to maybe like make secret financial transactions, to use these technologies to take power away from governments and corporations and give it to individuals. And that was like, that movement gave rise to WikiLeaks, among other things, which was what that book was about that I was writing at the time. And so I was sort of obsessed with the cypherpunks. And then in the midst of this, in 2011, I heard about what like was described to me as a new cypherpunk invention, which was Bitcoin. And I heard about it actually from Gavin Andreessen, like the one of the first developers of Bitcoin. And he gave a talk where he described it as like that had been created by this mysterious guy, Satoshi Nakamoto, and that it seemed to be, as he put it at the time, like the kind of holy grail of the cypherpunk movement. Like they had finally created the ability to send money anonymously, like digital cash that you could sort of like put, like unmarked bills in a briefcase and send it across the internet without revealing anything about yourself or your identity. And that seemed to me like it was going to unlock a new like underworld economy where people would buy and sell illegal things and like pay for God knows what. I mean, I had spent enough time with the cypherpunks to know that people were already dreaming about like markets for untraceably funded assassinations and like stolen goods and corporate secrets, and even like massive amounts of narcotics and things. And very soon, like all of that actually began to appear on the dark web, where where it had been possible to sort of like browse this hidden web, but now it was sort of monetized. Now there was a secret money to go with this like secret digital world, it seemed.
Did you immediately kind of recognize that Bitcoin would be something that actually took off as opposed to kind of a tech lark or fad? Could you kind of foresee how big it might be, or did it seem like it was going to be just something among the cypherpunks, something that would stay relatively small or not go mainstream?
No, I had no idea whether it would completely collapse. Like the fact that, like I said, that it had gone up from 50 cents to $1 seemed like, wow, this is such a volatile currency, and it seems sure to just like collapse back to pennies any second now. I did try to buy some at the time. I like tried just in the course of my reporting, writing this like first magazine piece for Forbes about Bitcoin. I tried to buy about $40 worth, which would have been 40 Bitcoins. And there was a bug in the only exchange at the time, Mt. Gox. It was like quite difficult to use. And I gave up, and now sometimes, try not to think about the fact that those 40 Bitcoins years later would have been worth millions and millions of dollars.
You could have been retired and just writing books all the time, not having to work at Wired anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, I tell myself that I didn't like, I couldn't have held those Bitcoins anyway because of a conflict of interest as a reporter. But then I think about the fact that like, I wouldn't even need to be a reporter. I would be so wealthy that I would just like retire if I had not been that stupid and actually like seen the investment potential of Bitcoin. But I wasn't really interested even in like that part of Bitcoin or its value. Even I saw it as like, this new way to like make untraceable transactions on the internet, which a lot of people did at the time. And the story of this book is how it turned out to be completely the opposite. Yeah, I
want to ask you, so you were onto Bitcoin very early. Kind of other people kind of took notice as Bitcoin's value rose, basically. I mean, there's I think people's interest in Bitcoin is it's so varied that there were the original people interested for security reasons, making anonymous payments online. And then entrepreneurs started to recognize the opportunities with Bitcoin, economists who were fascinated by it. But definitely different audiences came. And books were written about Bitcoin, I think, in those first couple of years, kind of 2014, 2015. Why did you decide to write this book now? Why did you not do a Bitcoin book earlier?
Yeah.
what was kind of, what made you feel like this was now the time to write it?
I mean, speaking very honestly, I tried to, right? I actually tried to write a book about in 2014, or I think around 2014, maybe 2015, that was about the ways that Bitcoin seemed like it was unlocking this world of online crime. And that book, that I pitched, I wrote a whole proposal and could not sell it about like the ways that like Bitcoin was powering the dark web drug markets, which by then were huge, but then also things like ransomware and cybercrime and even like very even darker worlds of like child sexual abuse video markets on the dark web. And
that's so interesting, because this is the flip side of that. You're with the book that you did write.
Exactly. So then but then as the years, first of all, I couldn't sell the book, I think because it was kind of in like a period where people had stopped caring about cryptocurrency. And then as the years passed, I slowly like had this like slow motion epiphany that maybe you had it earlier. I think we argued about this and you were right and I was wrong, that actually it turned out more, and as I read more of, well, first there was like sort of research showing this, and then there were technology companies that seemed to be able to demonstrate that Bitcoin was traceable. And in fact, like this, and I still over those years believed like, well, maybe you can use it carefully. Maybe if you use these tools, you can avoid having your Bitcoins traced. But then it was around 2020 that I began to see these Department of Justice announcements about one like sort of massive takedown of a cyber criminal operation after another would thank this company Chainalysis that I'd sort of barely heard of. And I began to see that actually, well, first I sort of had this idea that like maybe I would just write a profile of Chainalysis, this company that seemed to be tracing Bitcoins to just like enable one massive cyber criminal bust after another. And I met with one of the founders of Chainalysis, and he walked me through the history of the company, and it became clear to me that actually for years, Bitcoin had been like anything but untraceable. It had been the opposite of untraceable. And Chainalysis like had been this kind of, a very specific like tool enabling law enforcement agencies as a kind of secret weapon, where they were tracing the transactions of people who thought that they were using an untraceable currency for years and years. And that in fact, cryptocurrency tracing had been used in like many of the biggest cyber criminal takedowns of the last decade, that I had been, stories that I had wanted to write, that I had been like looking for, like the true untold story of how those investigations had happened. That Chainalysis and cryptocurrency tracing were at the very center of them, including like the takedown of the biggest drug and crime market in history, Alphabet, the biggest child sexual abuse materials market ever, called Welcome to Video. And so once I saw that there was in fact this story that was fully the opposite of the book that I had tried to write earlier, I could see that like there was a wonderful like larger narrative about not only like this kind of incredible true crime detective story, but like a really surprising, dramatic shift in the way that people thought about cryptocurrency and how it had actually served as this decade-long trap for people seeking financial privacy, but also criminals of all kinds.
Yeah, just to do some ground setting. I mean, I assume most people that are drawn to this book discussion probably know a bit about Bitcoin, but I mean, the way that Bitcoin kind of fundamentally works is that this is what struck me when we were working together and I did that thing where I lived on Bitcoin, was that it's this big ledger. It's a big public ledger. And the reason that you can kind of trust in a cryptocurrency is that you have all these computers that are kind of acting as a surveillance network to confirm that a transaction happened. And so, yeah, when I lived on it.
That's the blockchain. Right, like that's what everybody knows. Everybody's heard of the blockchain, but the blockchain, as you said, is just like a list of every Bitcoin transaction. So then, like, how could I be so stupid to think that Bitcoin?
Yeah, that was my question. How could you be so stupid?
Like,
I mean, because but how could everybody be so stupid? I mean, why why were people so convinced that they could use cryptocurrency for all kinds of illegal purposes, given that this is how it worked? Like,
Right.
why did people fall into this trap that was, I guess they'd sprung it without even realizing it, or been drawn to it for exactly the wrong reasons?
Well, I mean, just to be like, just in my own defense, my meager defense here, like Satoshi Nakamoto himself or herself, the mysterious creator of Bitcoin, in the very first email introducing his or her invention, in this email to a cryptography mailing list, listed like these bullet point features of Bitcoin that made it attractive, and one of them was that participants can be anonymous. Like that was what Satoshi wrote, and
which is not untrue, right? You can be anonymous,
right,
as long as you don't have a place where you're exposing your identity.
Pretty much. Yeah, I mean, it's true. So like the thing is, like, the blockchain does record every transaction, but it records transactions between Bitcoin addresses, which are these, like, 34 character long strings of numbers and letters, and there are no names, there's no email addresses, nothing identifiable in the blockchain, it seems. So like, you could see all of these transactions, but you couldn't tell who they were between. And that seems, so when I wrote this first piece about Bitcoin in 2011, I described it as an anonymous currency, and people immediately, like, nerds, like, attacked me and said, it's not anonymous, it is pseudonymous, because you're basically using it with a pseudonym, which is your Bitcoin address. And in fact, if you create a new address for every transaction, then like none of these can be tied together and connected to your identity. And I believe that, like, it sounded right, that, sure, you can see the transactions, but if you can't follow the money, if you can't, like, connect it to a person, then what good is that? Like, it's as good as untraceable. All you'll see are these, like, distinct, the sea of millions of transactions that mean nothing to you and can't be connected to any crime. So that's like the illusion that we were all operating under. I can talk about, like, then,
and when Bitcoin was first getting kind of started, people were more careful, right, about changing their cash to Bitcoin. I remember there was, like, basically, online forums where you would meet up with somebody in a coffee shop and maybe not even exchange, any kind of identifying information, and you give them $10 and they give you Bitcoin. But then you had the rise of kind of more official Bitcoin banks, right? Like the Coinbases of the world that are actually asking for your identifying documents. Is that kind of where it switched over to be more useful to law enforcement?
Well, I do think that as, like, Bitcoin grew and, people were more than, not just mining their own Bitcoins, which is a way to obtain Bitcoins, like potentially somewhat anonymously, but rather buying them from an exchange. And then exchanges started to be regulated, or at least just, like, they were sort of just discovered by regulators who require any sort of, like, official money transmitter like this to have know your customer laws. And so they had to collect identifying information about their users. Then if you could just follow the money to an exchange, or from an exchange to a person, then a law enforcement agency can send a subpoena to an exchange, get someone's identity. So then, like, immediately but then it seemed like, well, you buy your Bitcoins from an exchange, you send them to another address, and from that address on, nobody should be able to follow the money. And it still seemed possible to evade that kind of tracking. But then it was really, like, in 2013 that Sarah Micklejohn, who is, like, sort of one of the sort of central characters of the book, who I interviewed at the time, but also followed, reconnected with for this reporting, began to come up with, like, very clever ways to connect Bitcoin addresses, to show that, like, sometimes whole clusters, as she described them, like dozens or even millions sometimes of addresses belonged to a single person or organization. And then to identify those clusters of Bitcoin addresses by doing sneaky things like interacting with those clusters herself, like and thus, almost like an undercover cop, she could send Bitcoins to a Bitcoin service, like somebody she bought all sorts of things with Bitcoin, Sarah, by the way, is a researcher at the University of California, San Diego, or was at the time. And she just like started sort of manically interacting with every Bitcoin exchange, like all these different e-commerce sites that use Bitcoin, and even the Silk Road, which by then had this dark web market that had grown into a black market for every narcotic imaginable and Bitcoin. She would just send Bitcoins into the Silk Road and out again. And in doing so, just be able to see which addresses she had interacted with. And then sometimes showed that those addresses were part of a larger cluster that she'd identified, and thus be able to see other people's interactions with the Silk Road, this illegal black market for drugs.
So once you kind of had this epiphany, realizing that actually the blockchain Bitcoin is very traceable by law enforcement, what was the first investigation that you kind of reported out, or which investigators did you start talking to about how this worked? Did you go in through chain analysis, or just which was the big takedown that you pulled the thread on?
It's funny. I think I kind of did. I did all of this simultaneously. Like once I realized that there was this whole escalating chain of cases that a really small group of detectives who had like figured out that Bitcoin was traceable had taken on, and each one was bigger than the last. I did like kind of start reporting them all out in tandem.
That sounds awful. Which was your favorite then?
This was in 2020 when like everything was like this.
Yes.
Anyway. So I was just like doing like, essentially Zoom calls with like eventually sort of federal agent and prosecutor sources, like 9 to 5 practically. But I began to realize that there was really one, kind of amazingly, like one guy who I had already met, who I knew, who was the protagonist of all of this guy named Tigran Gambarian. And
How had you already met him?
I had been on a panel with Tigran where basically he was saying that like cryptocurrency was traceable and they would always be able to follow the money. And I was arguing against him. So but I was like pointing, I was pointing to like, technologies like Zcash and Monero, which we'll get into, like these newer cryptocurrencies that seems like they might actually be untraceable. But Tigran was a criminal investigator at the IRS. He was when I first met him, and he still was in 2020. And it turned out
he was based in California, DC. Where was he?
He was like at the beginning of the story. He was in Oakland, and his kind of part of the story begins after the bust of the Silk Road. So the Silk Road by like 2013, end of 2013, had grown into this massive black market for drugs. I had like been really obsessed with the Silk Road. I interviewed the creator of the Silk Road, who called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, and he was this like libertarian ideologue in a way who had tried to create a dark web market for what he described as victimless contraband, but that included like heroin and methamphetamines or whatever. And then he had made some like mistakes, nothing to do with cryptocurrency tracing. Actually, they got him caught. He turned out to be this 29-year-old Texan guy named Ross Ulbricht, and he was living in San Francisco. And he was busted by the FBI, the DHS. The IRS criminal investigations, but not my guy Tigran. And in fact, Tigran and his group in Oakland, like right across the bay from San Francisco, were a little bit or in particular his superiors were like kind of annoyed. Like, why didn't we get this guy who was in our backyard? The Silk Road was online for 2.5 years and did hundreds of millions of dollars worth of drug deals. And this guy was just right there, and so Tigran, who was this like very interesting. I mean, the IRS criminal investigations division is very interesting. They're these sort of forensic accountants, but they also carry guns and make arrests and are their own little law enforcement agency within IRS, but they get essentially like no respect from FBI or DEA, and were described to me as the redheaded stepchild of law enforcement by one judge. And Tigran is, I think, particularly like kind of has a chip on his shoulder, and was just like, as a junior agent then, like seeking to prove himself, and he got a tip. He also, I think, was like very skeptical and interesting, and like you, maybe he sort of looked at Bitcoin from the beginning and thought like, this blockchain thing looks like it's a record of every transaction. I should be able to trace these this currency. I don't believe that this is untraceable. And he got a tip from a cryptocurrency exchange that this guy, Karl Mark Force, was cashing out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoins of like unknown origin. And Tigran figured out that Karl Mark Force was actually a DEA agent who was on the Silk Road investigation, that he had been investigating the Silk Road. And Tigran then, just like without using any of, he didn't even really like have any tools. He barely sort of knew Sarah Mickeljohn's tricks, but he sat down in his living room, like, you know, after hours, and just kind of, as he put it, like hand traced on the blockchain manually, and that he could show that Karl Mark Force's hundreds of thousands of dollars of Bitcoins had come from the Silk Road. In fact, it would turn out that Force had been selling law enforcement information to the Dread Pirate Roberts, the creator of the Silk Road, as a double agent, and also trying to extort him, and thought that he was going to get away with it. And Force was caught this way. He was the first person ever identified and like proven to have done something criminal through cryptocurrency tracing. But then amazingly, there was this other sum of like $350,000 worth of Bitcoins that had come off the Silk Road, but nobody could figure out where they had ended up. Like they had been stolen from the site, but everybody that is on Tigran's team, the prosecutors working with him, assumed that must have been Karl Mark Force too, this DEA agent, this corrupt agent. And it turned out Tigran was able to follow that money too on the blockchain and show that it had gone to a different corrupt agents, a Secret
It's really
Service
incredible
agent.
to me that there were two different corrupt federal agents
Yes.
working the Silk Road investigation.
Not only that, but they were, this is a corrupt Secret Service agent, Sean Bridges, and a corrupt DEA agent, Karl Mark Force. And they were both based in Baltimore, in the same office, same investigative team. And they didn't even know about each other's crimes. They just like happened to, both be trying to pull the same, incredible corrupt stunt. And this was described to me as like a kind of like lightning striking twice thing. Like, can you believe that there were two federal agents who both tried to steal from the Silk Road? But it seems to me more like, if you think about the way that Bitcoin was seen at the time, like, and if you are if you have that inclination to try to grab money from an investigation when you can, and you think that it's untraceable, that like you can do this with total impunity, then it's kind of amazing that there were just two cases of this.
Right, they fell into the trap that
exactly. I mean, it is very much like The Wire with like the two Baltimore cops, like who just like they have a very hard time just like not grabbing the cash from drug dealers that's under the mattress or whatever. So and both those guys went to prison, but that was also the beginning of like a new era in law enforcement, where people like Tigran and increasingly like everybody else could now see that it was possible to trace Bitcoin, to trace cryptocurrency, to actually make these cases. And very soon, Tigran, actually in that Sean Bridges case, he just kind of by chance met one of the co-founders of Chainalysis, this first company, this startup that was building automated tools to trace cryptocurrency. Michael Groniger was a Danish.
And so Chainalysis came out of Kraken, right? The Bitcoin, the Bitcoin kind of exchange service.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Michael Groniger was, I think, one of the founders of Kraken, a cryptocurrency exchange. But in 2014 or so, Mt. Gox, the first exchange that I mentioned, that was always kind of buggy and decrepit, fell apart and went bankrupt. And it was revealed that it had been hacked by unknown hackers who had stolen $500 million from it, and this completely tanked the Bitcoin market. Kraken, for Michael Groninger, like didn't seem like a great place to be anymore, because it was that kind of first crypto winter, which people now feel like we're in again. And so he had this idea of like, well, maybe if I can sort of help to prove that Bitcoin is transparent and like you can follow the money, and even help figure out who stole that Mt. Gox money, that $500 million from that had been taken from Mt. Gox and destroyed the company, that would help to sort of resuscitate Bitcoin's reputation. And so he went off to start a new company called Chainalysis, and he just happened to, like through a friend, meet Tigran Gambaryan on a trip to San Francisco. And he helped Tigran to trace Sean Bridges, that Secret Service agent's money. And then they sort of like saw the potential of working together and became this like very unlikely team. I mean, Tigran is like a Armenian American law enforcement agent, and Michael Groninger is sort of an old school Bitcoiner nerd from Denmark, and like, but they began to work together very closely.
Not like a cypherpunk, I want to use this for anonymous purposes nerd, more of a Bitcoin is going to transform financial markets kind of Bitcoiner. So he was not as interested in kind of privacy and anonymity aspects of it.
I think his dream was like the Bitcoin would be like, you could buy and sell it at your bank and hold it, and that everybody would have it and maybe use it for like normal, legitimate things. But he never believed that, he never even really understood how cypherpunks or crypto anarchists or whoever even could imagine that this thing was untraceable, because he could see that it wasn't. Like Tigran, like Sarah Meiklejohn, and he built a whole company around this, and very quickly took Sarah Meiklejohn's techniques basically and built them into a tool that could implement them like in a way that where any law enforcement agents who quickly became his customers could use this tool called Reactor to trace Bitcoins. And soon, he and Tigran were using this together to investigate the Mt. Gox theft. I mean, sort of. I mean, basically Tigran just happened to be working on another case, which was BTCE. I remember, I think you wrote about BTCE at the time. It was this kind of mysterious cryptocurrency exchange.
No one knew where it was based, who ran it.
Exactly.
Really strange.
It was sort of this black hole in the cryptocurrency economy. And using Reactor, I mean, just in general, you could see that like all kinds of criminal cryptocurrency was flowing into BTCE where it was being cashed out. And nobody knew like who even owns this shady operation that seems to be essentially like a money laundering operation.
I actually never knew what happened to BTCE until I read your book, and it was fascinating to find out the story behind the company.
Well, I mean, I didn't either, but it turned out. I mean, the amazing thing is that as Tigran investigated BTCE and started like digging into who owned it and who had created it, and Michael Groninger had taken on the Mt. Gox mystery. He had actually taken on the Mt. Gox bankruptcy trustees as his first pro bono customer, trying to solve this mystery of who had stolen all of their money. These cases kind of converged, and it turned out that the stolen Mt. Gox money had been fed into BTCE. And not only that, but the person who had fed that money into this mysterious exchange BTCE had also been one of the creators of BTCE. And just to kind of skip ahead, this turned out to be this Russian guy, Alexander Vinnik, who amazingly seemed to have been involved in the Mt. Gox heist, the theft of like, how much, like 850,000 Bitcoins?
Like in the real world, it's like somebody walked into a Bank of America, stole all their money, and then went across the street and started their own bank with all that money. And people weren't able to see the connection.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's like, it was like they had stolen so much that they needed to create their own whole exchange just to, find a way to launder it, essentially. And that's what they did. But then BTCE had become, in the process, its own, like, open to all sorts of cyber criminals, money laundering operation, and ransomware payments were going into it, and dark web drug market profits. And
And it was
to
one of
get
the
there.
banks, it was one of the banks where you could cash out Bitcoin without having to hand over your passport or your driver's license. They weren't asking for identification.
Right, because it wasn't, because nobody could even figure out where it was located, kind of amazingly. I mean, Tigran figured it out pretty quickly, but it seemed like nobody had really, like, I don't know. It was in the early days, and it was sort of like, well, we can't figure out where this is located, so we can't enforce know your customer laws against this exchange. Yeah, it had become this just, vast, like all millions and millions of dollars in incredibly shady money was flowing into it.
It seemed
But
like
then,
basically there were many years where law enforcement realized this kind of fallibility of Bitcoin and blockchain, and the wider world didn't realize. Did you find it hard at all to get law enforcement to be open with you, to tell you about these techniques? For them, was it that the game is up at this point? They're willing to reveal just how traceable it is. Kind of like, what was your experience working with law enforcement on the book about how much they wanted to
well,
talk about how possible this is?
I think if I had been smarter and had tried to, tell stories about how Bitcoin tracing was being used to take down these as a secret weapon, in those early days of like 2014, 2015, maybe they would not have been willing to talk about it. But I was asking in 2020, it took me that long to really understand the power of this tool. And I think by then, I mean, Chainalysis wanted to tell these stories as much as they could, because they're a startup, and they had been at the center of what would turn out to be like an incredible string of busts. And startups like to talk about their successes, obviously. And then IRS criminal investigations, as I said, also I think is enough of an underdog that they too, I mean, Tigran and others there wanted the due credit that they deserved for like having pulled off these incredible takedowns. I did find that it was very difficult to get the FBI to talk. I mean, the FBI is like, they get the credit that they want whenever they want it. And it seems like that as a result, they're too cool for school and don't really didn't want to tell me these stories. But then kind of started to, once it became clear that the IRS criminal investigators were getting their credit for it. And then also I don't know, once you, just in general, once you start to kind of find loose threads and sources who are willing to tell stories, they lead you to the next. And then once people realize that this person is getting the everyone to talk, this is going to be the definitive story, they want to tell you their part of it too. And that was more the case with the next big part of the story, which was Alphabet, in 2016, after the takedown, after the kind of.
So after Silk Road went down, was Alphabet kind of the inheritor of basically all the black
eventually, yeah. Right. So yeah, after the Silk Road was taken down in 2013, the Silk Road 2 popped up, which was taken down a year later. The Silk Road 2 had some of the same staff as Silk Road 1 who had been identified in the first investigation even. So that would made it, I think, pretty easy. It was basically a copycat site. But then that had been replaced by another dark web market. And then that one that was Evolution, and they ran off. The administrators stole everybody's money and disappeared, which happens, from time to time.
Happens from time to time in crypto, it seems.
Yeah. And then another site had taken the top position, and they retired essentially. And then Alphabet appeared. And at this point, honestly, I did not at that point understand that Alphabet would be interesting, because I had seen this whack-a-mole of so many dark web markets come and go. But Alphabet would turn out to be kind of the next massive dark web drug market, and by its peak would in fact be 10 times the size of the Silk Road at its peak. So by the middle of 2016, Alphabet was not only the biggest dark web drug market, but the biggest in history, and still growing faster than we'd ever seen one grow before. And this was in part because it was founded by a kind of central figure who was really different from the Dread Pirate Roberts. Dread Pirate Roberts was like this, at least seemingly, a kind of idealist who wanted only to foster victimless crime. He was this, he like had a crypto anarchist book club on his user forum, and like recommended people read all this libertarian philosophy and stuff. Alpha O2 was the name of this pseudonymous creator of Alphabay, and he was a famous credit card fraudster, or a well-known one anyway. And Alphabay distinguished itself by like being essentially totally amoral. You could buy and sell hacking tools and stolen credit card information and identity theft and everything, as well as, he kind of fused the worlds of fraud and hacking on the dark web with the drug market. And that quickly made Alphabay just, a gigantic black market for everything. And it seemed at first like he was Russian. He kind of pretended to be Russian and signed his messages in Russian. And this initially convinced everyone tracking him, and he became the kind of public enemy #1 of all of these law enforcement agencies looking at the dark web, that he might be in Russia and thus like completely untouchable. Until essentially, sorry, if we
is the takedown of Alphabay mostly, would you say mostly due to the ability to track Bitcoin blockchain?
Well, it's interesting. Like the first tip that gave people the real name of Alpha O2 was not that. It was like it was a slip up, like the kind that the Dread Pirate Roberts had made, where in the very first days that Alphabay was online, it turned out a welcome email from the site included metadata that revealed this email address, pimpalex91@hotmail.com, which turned out to be Alexander Coz's email, the email address of Alpha O2, this French Canadian guy living in Bangkok. But that seemed almost too, like this came as a tip into the DEA office in Fresno, of all places. I mean, Fresno was a really unlikely place for this case to originate, because it's not like the Southern District of New York or whatever. It's not a big office. And they were sort of like, we can't really have found like this good a lead, right? I mean, they never expected to be able to take down a dark web kingpin, and they didn't even truly trust their lead for a long time. They were like, maybe this guy is just being set up. This is kind of too good to be true. And then just as they learned this guy's name, Alexander Koz, at the same time, these two FBI analysts in Washington, D.C. had the idea of like a new idea of how to use chain analysis as tools actually to try to identify Alpha O2, which was this kind of interesting idea of like, well, what if we look within the Alphabay cluster for the amount, like the largest sums of money sorry, to back up a little bit, whenever like an exit scam happens, like the kind I described, where the administrators of a dark web market run off with everybody's money, everybody on the dark web freaks out, and they pull their money out of dark web markets, and they tell each other, don't store any money on a dark web market that you're not about to use. And that's good advice, and but these two FBI analysts, who told me to call them Ali and Aaron, they had this idea, what if we look for the sums of money on the blockchain in the Alphabay cluster that never moves, even when an exit scam happens? Because after all, the only person who's not going to worry about an exit scam is the boss, is the administrator of the site himself.
Really brilliant idea.
And they did that, and they found like exactly that, like a massive cluster within the Alphabay cluster that turned out to be Alpha O2's.
That person felt comfortable leaving a lot of money on the Alphabay.
Right. But that money had persisted in this one spot, had not moved during exit scams, and then had eventually, like in different threads, moved out to cryptocurrency exchanges where it was cashed out. And they actually identified, like they followed this money to an exchange, sent a subpoena, like they got a subpoena sent to that exchange. After they sent the subpoena, they learned Alexander Koz's name from the team in Fresno, just through the grapevine. But then just days later, the results of their subpoena came back and approved that yes, this was Alexander Koz's money, that he had actually sent it out, and like more than a dozen exchanges had received Alphabay money in both his name and his wife's name. And that was the real confirmation of his identity, and led to a kind of like sort of ridiculously epic bust, where they did this massive sting operation. We're coming up on we're running out of time here. But I can't tell the whole story. But like they had
Read the book; it's really good.
This is the exciting part. They did. So they identified him. He was in Bangkok, but he had learned a lot of tricks from the Silk Road, and one of them was that you never work on your dark web market outside of your own home. The Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross Ulbricht, had been caught in part because he was caught the moment he was caught by the FBI. He had logged into the Silk Road from his laptop in the public library in San Francisco, and in fact, his laptop and Alexander Coz's both had a kind of encryption where if you even just closed the lid of the laptop, then the secrets on that machine would be, inaccessible forever for many human lifetimes to even like very powerful computers trying to crack the code. So I think he
had to like arrest these people while the computers were open,
exactly.
so that you have the evidence to convict them
For
and get access to all of their money and
yeah. So for Ross Ulbricht, they were able to distract him with this like fake fight behind him, and then an undercover agent grabbed his machine while in an open state, logged into Silk Road, and that's how he was, caught red-handed. With Alexander Koz, the kingpin of Alphabet, he had learned his lesson and he never worked on Alphabet outside of his home. And also, if he just shut the lid of his laptop, it too would be encrypted and inaccessible. So they had to kind of stage this insanely elaborate sting operation to trick him into coming out of his home with his laptop open and like get into his house, which was like behind a gate in this neighborhood in the outskirts of Bangkok to grab his machine. But yeah, maybe we should leave that the action.
Ryan, do you want to come in with questions?
Yeah, wow. I'm if anyone has any questions, Bruin, you can put it in the chat right now. After that thrilling, I could see it being shot in my mind with like a cinematographer. Yeah, if you have any questions, you could put it on in the chat or message me. Oh, wonderful. One person said, Suki said, since cryptocurrency is proven to be traceable, do you think that cyber criminals will avoid crypto and use other untraceable means for transaction? If so, how will that impact on the work law enforcement agencies are doing to track them down?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I mentioned just like really briefly in passing earlier that there are newer cryptocurrencies like Monero and Zcash, and these are cryptocurrencies that were designed to not be traceable, to avoid the mistakes of Bitcoin, if you can call them that. I mean, Monero kind of tangles all of its transactions on the blockchain and combines them and makes it very difficult to follow the money. Zcash essentially encrypts its whole blockchain, uses really fancy new cryptography tricks to like essentially confirm transactions on a blockchain that reveals nothing about anyone's transactions to the public. So I believe that I actually do, I mean, forgive me, I'm maybe making this same mistake twice. I do think that Zcash might actually be untraceable. But Monero is interesting because it seems very difficult to trace, but there are already signs that it too, in some cases, may be somewhat traceable too, or at least like not with certainty, but with probability. You can sometimes still follow the money with Monero. And history is kind of repeating itself, that people who thought that they once again were untraceable using this specifically designed privacy currency have been traced. I mean, the earlier this year, the biggest seizure of not just of cryptocurrency, but of money, period, of any kind in the history of the Department of Justice was this money laundering case where I think 120,000 Bitcoins were stolen from another cryptocurrency exchange, Bitfinex, and that was traced to this couple in New York. And in the IRS's documents that they released with the indictment, it seemed to me to show at one point, like, and Monero people argue with me about this endlessly, that the IRS did trace Monero. So, I do think that like this cat and mouse game is not over.
Amazing. Wow, there's a questions flying in after this. M. Cohen said, Andy, what are your longer term thoughts re the future of crypto's viability?
I'm it's really nobody can say, but I've never even like been interested in trying to say like whether crypto will catch on or become legitimate or gain in value or anything. I've always just been interested in the ways that cryptocurrency is used for subversive and illegal things. And even like during this crypto winter or whatever, that the value of Bitcoin has plunged. That's, I think, made it much less attractive for legitimate users, but it hasn't made it any less attractive for all of the the ne'er-do-wells who are still demanding extortion payments in cryptocurrency, the North Korean hackers who are still stealing billions and billions of dollars worth of it. For them, the attraction of this currency is still that it is, both, well, it's that it can evade regulation. I mean, it's this is kind of like a complicated thought, but it's like for those kind of bad actors, it doesn't matter to them that it can be traced because they're beyond the reach of law enforcement in Russia or China or North Korea. So the fact that they can simply like that we know who they are doesn't actually allow us to arrest them or whatever. So that's just to say that like the part of the cryptocurrency world, the underworld that I've been interested has never gone away with all of the booms and busts of Bitcoin's value.
Amazing. Alrighty, we're just gonna breeze through the rest of the questions. Viren asked, thanks for all the insights. Downloaded my book on Audible yesterday in my time zone and started listening. Question, along with Chainalysis, have you worked with worked in slowmist/mistrack.io? If yes, what are your views?
Sorry, I don't know what that is.
Sorry, slowmist slash.
That sounds interesting.
I know. Now I'm like, I'm gonna keep Googling.
But there are just your
crypto trackers.
Sorry, what's that?
Maybe other crypto trackers of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, now to be clear, like Chainalysis is not alone. They're an $8.6 billion company, which is kind of remarkable. I mean, Bitcoin, as I said, has boomed and busted over this time, but Chainalysis just keeps growing and doubling in value, like practically every month at this rate or something. But then there are also all of these other companies that have followed in their footsteps, like Elliptic and TRM Labs, and there's a whole industry of companies that are really competing to be the best at cryptocurrency tracing and to develop new techniques, which is part of why this cat and mouse game is now so vicious. Like if the mice are being tracked by an entire industry of people competing for the smartest minds at finding new ways to track them. I would like, can I also, I think Andrew counts as my editor, so I'm obliged to answer his question. But also, it's a really good question, which is, how did you work to balance out your story about police catching criminals to not be overly pro law enforcement? And I think it's like, I certainly did not, I have never really told a story from law enforcement's perspective before. It was really interesting to do it, but really, I've always wanted to tell stories from the perspective of people like the Dread Pirate Roberts, which is what I did in 2013. And I did have real hesitation about telling essentially a pro law enforcement story, or a story that sort of inherently feels pro law enforcement because it's told from their perspective. But I do realize, and I did try to thread through the book this notion that maybe the fact that we can trace these cryptocurrencies is not just an entirely good thing. Bitcoin was designed in part as a kind of safety valve from the, all pervasive financial surveillance that still persists today. I mean, you cannot use a credit card. You cannot use practically money of any kind. I mean, there's less cash used in the world than ever without being tracked in so many ways. And it's not like that. It should disturb us, I think, that there is no way essentially to spend money privately. And Sarah Meiklejohn, I want to say I sort of wanted to use her in this way, but I didn't just use her. She is in some ways the conscience of this story. Sarah Meiklejohn, who invented so many of these techniques, remained really ambivalent about the fact that she had created these tools that had become the basis for a whole industry of tracking and used by law enforcement. And she actually she had intended her research to be almost more like a public service announcement about the fact that cryptocurrencies can be traced. And so I sort of follow her through the book as well, and her ambivalence and her feelings about what she had created. I mean, in a, not to put it too dramatically, but a Robert Oppenheimer kind of way. And into the like the very one of the final scenes of the book, not to spoil things, is that she turned down a job with Chainalysis because she did not want to be, as she described it, a cyber narc. You know, she wanted to kind of maintain her position outside this cat and mouse game and not give in to the pull of this seductive like pull of becoming a player in this cops and robbers true crime story that is very fun to tell as a reporter, but is far from the whole picture.
Amazing. Let's see. I like the funny question of Joe saying, Andy, in which book format will make you the most money when we buy it? Hardcover, paperback, audio, or other. I don't know.
I appreciate you asking, Joe. I mean, just whatever you want. I am quite annoyed to realize, though, that audiobooks don't count towards the bestseller lists. And I sell more audiobooks than any other format, at least for my last book, and I think for this one too so far,
and
which is really strong.
Not to be a total shill, but if you want to go to Libro FM, there's also a good way to support local bookstores within audiobook stuff too. So that's a fun one that helps support. I think it does go to our numbers for McNally, but they don't always, especially with Audible, they just don't. So
right. Well, I'm obliged. Yeah, I mean, Joe, you should buy a signed hardcover from McNally Jackson.
No, you do not need to. It's all good. But can you accept Bitcoin for purchasing the book sale? I don't know.
Absolutely not.
That's what Suki said. I'm interested in what Jackson said in the chat, which is before we have a couple questions before we end. Do any intelligence agencies secretly use the crypto market for dark budget purposes?
You know, I don't. It's a good question. Like, I assume that question is about U.S. intelligence agencies.
Yeah,
I have no idea, and I kind of doubt it, just because I can imagine they're so bureaucratic, and the paperwork would just be, too complicated. But yeah, but as M. Cohen says here, like, yes, absolutely, other countries do. The even the Russian hackers, the GRU military intelligence agency, who are the subject of my last book, they used Bitcoin to try to obfuscate their funding of like setting up infrastructure for hacking the 2016 election. North Korea raises a vast amount of the budget of its government through stealing billions of dollars of cryptocurrency. So yes, like other countries, more sort of like, I don't know, bad actors certainly use cryptocurrency.
Well, I have a quick question before we end it. I was curious about a lot of this time when I was researching and reading about your book, I became anxious for you in your investigations. And I was curious about, has there ever been, describe a time, I guess, that has been like, you've been in too deep, or have you ever been scared for yourself during this investigation? Or has it all kind of been, have you felt calm about this whole thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, so much of this book was written like from just like, from here, from I was, just like hiding from my family, as I am now in my home, in my home office, just writing. It was hard to like, and also, I guess also because this is a story of where so many of the, not all, but so many of the antagonists went to prison. That's like, because their cryptocurrency was traced. There was not that much to worry about. The only time like I've ever really like, I guess, been more worried was my last book, when I was traveling in Ukraine and much more so in Russia, and writing about, as I said, the Russian military intelligence agency, and trying to like expose their activities and figure out, who they were and stuff. And that may have just been my paranoia. I don't know if I ever got their attention enough to warrant that fear. But yeah, I like, traveling in Russia, I had to like use burner devices and not log into any accounts, and it was a really terrible and annoying and lonely experience because you can't. It's very hard to even talk to, your friends and family
Mm, mm.
doing that.
Dang. Well, I'm glad you're safe behind the red fuzzy wall. And I thank you so much, both Kashmir and Andy, for all of this. And thank you everyone who gave such great questions. Be sure to pick up the book online or in person. And thank you. Have a good rest of your night. Stay safe and don't get traced, I guess. Yeah, and look at that. I mean, amazing, beautiful book right there. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.